Welcome to our weekly reading of The Ecology of Freedom by Murray Bookchin. We are starting episode 2, Outlook of Organic Society. The notion that man is destined to dominate nature is by no means a universal feature of human culture. If anything, this notion is almost completely alien to the outlook of so-called primitive or pre-literate communities. I cannot emphasize too strongly that the concept emerged very gradually from a broader social development, the increasing domination of human by human. The breakdown of primordial quality into hierarchical systems of inequality, the disintegration of early kinship groups into social classes, the dissolution of tribal communities into the city, finally, the usurpation of social administration by the state all profoundly altered not only social life but also the attitude of people towards each other, humanity's vision of itself, and ultimately its attitude towards the natural world. In many ways, we are still agonized by the problems that emerge with these sweeping changes. Perhaps only by examining the attitude of certain pre-literate peoples can we gauge the extent to which domination shapes the most intimate thoughts and the most minute actions of the individual today. Until recently, discussions about the outlook of pre-literate peoples were distinctly different from our own. To speak of what was called primitive mentality as a pre-logical phenomenon, to use Levi Bruhl's unhappy term, or more recently, in the language of mythopoetically oriented mystics, non-linear thinking, results from a prejudicial misunderstanding of early social sensibilities. From a formal viewpoint, there is a very real sense in which pre-literate peoples were or are obliged to think in much the same linear sense as we are in dealing with the more mundane aspects of life. Whether their shortcomings as a substitute for wisdom and a world outlook, conventional logical operations are needed for survival. Human-gathered plants, man-shaped hunting implements, and children contrived game according to logical procedures that were closely akin to our own. This formal similarity is not at issue in discussing the pre-literate outlook towards society. What is significant about the differences in outlook between ourselves and pre-literate peoples is that while the latter think like us in a structural sense, their thinking occurs in a cultural context that is fundamentally different from our own. Although their logical operations may be identical to ours formally, their values differ from ours qualitatively. The farther back we go to communities that lack economic classes and a political state, communities that might well be called organic societies because of their intense solidarity internally and with the natural world, the greater evidence we find of an outlook towards life that visualizes people, things, and relations in terms of their uniqueness rather than their superiority or inferiority. To such communities, individuals and things were not necessarily better or worse than each other. They were simply dissimilar. Each was prized for itself, indeed for its unique traits. The conception of individual autonomy had not yet acquired the fictive sovereignty it has achieved today. The world was perceived as a composite of many different parts, each indispensable to its unity and harmony. Individuality, to the extent that it did not conflict with the community interest on which the survival of all depended, was seen more in terms of interdependence than independence. Variety was prized within the larger tapestry of the community as a priceless ingredient of communal unity. In the various organic societies where this outlook still prevails, notions such as equality and freedom do not exist. They are implicit in the very outlook itself. Moreover, because they are not placed in juxtaposition to the concept of inequality and unfreedom, these notions lack definability. As Dorothy Lee observed in her deeply incisive and sensitive essays on this outlook, equality exists in the very nature of things, as a byproduct of the democratic structure of the culture itself, not as principle to be applied. In such societies, there is no attempt to achieve the goal of equality, and in fact, there is no concept of equality. Often there is no linguistic mechanism whatever for comparison. What we find is absolute respect for men, for all individuals, irrespective of age and sex. Reading the footnote, see Dorothy Lee, Freedom and Culture. Dorothy Lee's essays stand almost alone in the literature on primitive mentality, and my debt to her material and interpretation is considerable. Although her data and views have become increasingly widespread lately, it is unfortunate that she has received so little mention, not to speak of acknowledgement, among recent journalistic critique of hierarchy. The absence of coercive and domineering values in organic cultures is perhaps best illustrated by the syntax of the Wintu Indians, a people that Lee studied very closely. She notes that terms commonly expressive of coercion in modern languages are arranged in Wintu syntax to denote cooperative behavior instead. A Wintu mother, for example, does not take a baby into the shade, she goes with it. A chief does not rule his people, he stands with them. They never say, and in fact, they never say as we do, I have a sister or a son or a husband, Lee observes. To live with is the usual way in which they express what we call possessions. They use this term for everything that they respect, so that a man will be said to live with his bow and arrows. The phrase to live with implies not only a deep sense of mutual respect for person and high regard for individual voluntarism. It also implies a profound sense of unity between the individual and the group. We did not go farther than an examination of American Indian life to find abundant evidence of this fact. The traditional society of the Hopi was geared entirely towards group solidarity. Nearly all the basic tasks of all community, from planting to food preparation, were done cooperatively. Together with the adults, children participated in most of these tasks. At every age level, the individual was charged with a sense of responsibility for the community, so all-pervasive were these group attitudes that Hopi children placed in schools administered by whites could be persuaded only with the greatest difficulty to keep score in competitive games. These strong attitudes of intragroup solidarity were fostered in the earlier days of Hopi childhood and continued through life. It began in infancy with a process of winning, which emphasized interdependence between Hopi individuals and the group, in marked contrast to the surrounding white culture's emphasis on independence. Winning is not merely a transition from milk to solid food, observes Dorothy Egan in the study of Hopi socialization. It is also a gradual process of achieving independence from the comfort of the mother's body and care, of transferring affection to other persons, and of finding satisfaction within oneself and in the outside world. In this sense, many whites are never weaned which has unfortunate consequences in a society where individual effort and independence are stressed. The Hopi child, on the other hand, from the day of his birth, was being weaned from the biological mother. But his weaning process resulted not from social indifference or maternal neglect, to the contrary, and very characteristically, many arms gave him comfort, many faces smiled at him. And from a very early age, he was given bits of food which were chewed by various members of the family and placed in his mouth. So for a Hopi, outside world in which he needed to find satisfaction was never far away. It's a pretty good start. What do you make of this? It's a pretty beautiful kind of beginning of outlining organic societies as they differ from modern societies, and how we have these notions of freedom in opposition to non-freedom or unfreedom, equality versus non-equality. While they didn't even have in their language, in their ontology, in the lived experience itself, there was no such thing outside of freedom. Things were free because they were uniquely different. And he's giving a bunch of examples of how that looks like through language by the Wintu people, the Hopi people, and others. I guess the question then becomes, how do we create realities that are based on those ontologies in our own day-to-day life?
It makes me think of just how powerful language is to begin with, and how those changes can still be made in how we speak and talk to other people to make some of those changes happen, almost as a result of the way we're speaking.
Yeah. I love that we were just talking about Hopi babies, and I'm hearing your baby in the background.
He's in my arms right now.
It's beautiful. I hope there are many faces smiling at him.
There actually are.
It's good. Well, this is where we start now.
Okay. Absolutely. I did want to also mention another thing, and it's that it seems like David Graeber's Dawn of Everything basically edits or builds on a lot of this chapter in particular.
Yeah, completely.
Since there's just new anthropological information out there since this was written.
Yeah, completely. Like Mori Bookchin was even ahead of his time, which is not that long ago, but there is just more and more information being excavated and exposed on how not only have these societies, and he is talking about like pre-literate, but there have also been, I think since then, and you mentioned David Graeber, so he discovered that there have been actually advanced literate societies who have had urban centers and complex political structures and governing systems and whatnot, and still lived according to these principles. So I think there is a common argument that say like, yeah, all of this is nice and well, but the moment we kind of moved from tribal societies, hunter-gathering, to urban, as if, and that's a myth, as David Graeber elaborates, as if that was like a linear kind of progression, then that's not possible anymore, because now we are living in such big groups, so we have to have states, we have to have all of these structures of power and hierarchy, and those are naturally merging the bigger the group is. But that I think is the contribution of David Graeber, and maybe he's also going to elaborate here in this book. I don't know, I haven't gotten there, but at least the kind of extra layer that the Dawn of Everything is adding is like, no, actually, these urban societies in big groups have existed for for thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years, and still portrayed very similar ontologies to those of what we call primitive societies, in the way that they saw community, freedom, equality, uniqueness as like inherent structures of reality itself, not something that needs to be fought for or in opposition to inequality. It was just non-existent. There was no ownership, right? I think that's a very interesting thing, like, because otherwise you can always say like, oh, okay, well, but they lived in small groups. If I had just a small group in a tribe, like that could also work, but no, like this can also exist in massive groups. Yeah. The feeling of unity between the individual and the community emerges a feeling of unity between the community and its environment. I find it interesting that he kind of emphasized that human domination over nature is a byproduct of human domination over other humans. I kind of always thought about it in the opposite direction. Maybe it's not that binary and either or, but I just think it's interesting. At first, we started thinking about each other in independent ownership ways. Then we started dominating nature. Psychologically, people in organic communities must believe that they exercise a greater influence on natural forces than it actually afforded them by the relatively simple technology. Such a belief is fostered by group rituals and magical procedures. Elaborate as these rituals and procedures may be, however, humanity's sense of dependence on the natural world, indeed on its immediate environment, never disappeared. Although this sense of dependence may generate abject fear or an equally abject reverence, there is a point in the development of organic society where it visibly generates a sense of symbiosis, of communal interdependence and cooperation that tend to transcend raw feelings of terror and awe. Here, people not only propitiate powerful forces or try to, what is propitiate? Never heard this one. Propitiate. Win or reign the favor of a god, spirit, or person by doing something that pleases them. Good to know. Here, people not only propitiate powerful forces or try to manipulate them, their ceremonials help, as they see it, in a creative sense. They aid in multiplying food animals, or in bringing changes in weather and season, or in promoting the fertility of crops. The organic community is conceived to be part of the balance of nature, forest community or a soil community. In short, a truly ecological community or eco-community, peculiar to its ecosystem, with an active sense of participation in the overall environment and the cycles of nature. The fine distinction between fear and reverence becomes more evident when we turn to accounts for certain ceremonial amongst pre-literate peoples. Aside from ceremonial and rituals characterized by social functions, such as initiation rites, we encounter others marked by ecological functions. Among the Hopi, major horticultural ceremonies, the role of summoning forth the cycles of the cosmic order, of actualizing the solstice and the different stages of the growth of maize from germination to maturation. Although this order and these stages are known to be predetermined, human ceremonial involvement is an integral part of that predetermination. In contrast to strictly magical procedures, Hopi ceremonies assign a participatory rather than a manipulatory function to humans. People play a complementary role in natural cycles. They facilitate the workings of the cosmic order. Their ceremonies are part of a complex web of life that extends from the germination of corn to the arrival of the solstice. As Dorothy Lee observes, every aspect of nature, plants and rocks and animals, colors and cardinal directions, a number of sex distinctions, the dead and the living, all have a cooperative share in the maintenance of the universal order. Eventually, the effort of each individual, human or not, goes into the huge whole. And here too, it is every aspect of a person which counts. The entire being of the Hopi individual affects the balance of nature. And as each individual develops his inner potential, so he enhances his participation, so does the entire universe becomes invigorated. I'm loving this. Contemporary ecological rhetoric tends to blur the wealth of implications that follow from the integration of the individual community and environment into a universal order. Since Lee penned these lines, almost every one of her words have become the cheap coin of the human potential movement. Pre-literate cultures, in fact, often begin with a cosmology consisting of the conclusion that our current bouquet of mystic profess to attain. Pre-literate cultures, in fact, often begin with a cosmology consisting of the conclusion that our current bouquet of mystics profess to attain. I love this kind of bringing in a little critique of white modern spiritualism. To organic societies, the puzzling cosmological issue is not life, which exists everywhere and in all things. The puzzle is death. The inexplicably unique condition of non-living and hence non-being. Soul, in some sense, permeates the entirety of existence. The dead matter that sense has given us the dead matter that science has given us since the Renaissance, as Hans Jonas has so sensitively pointed out, was yet to be discovered, as indeed its concept, so familiar to us, is anything but obvious. What is most natural to organic societies is an abundantly fecund, all-encompassing livingness that is integral to its knowingness, a world of life that occupies the whole foreground, exposes to man's immediate view, earth, wind, and water, begetting, teeming, nurturing, destroying, are anything but models of mere matter. I think that's an interesting thing on death here, like how non-being was more puzzling to them than anything, because what else is there other than livingness permeating everything as a process that keeps happening? Like nothing goes anywhere. The direct involvement of humanity with nature is thus not an abstraction. Dorothy Lee's account of the Hopi ceremonials is not a description of primitive man's science, as Victorian anthropologists believed. Nature begins as life, From the very outset of human consciousness, it enters directly into consciation with humanity, not merely harmonization or even balance. Nature as life eats at every repast, succors every new birth, grows with every child, aids every hand that throws a spear or plucks a plant, warms itself at the hearth in the dancing shadow, and sits amidst the counsels of the community, just as the rustle of the leaves and grasses is part of the air itself, not merely a sound born in the wind. Ecological ceremonial validate the citizenship nature acquires as part of the human environment. The people, to use the name that many pre-literate communities give to themselves, do not disappear into nature or nature into the people, but nature is not merely a habitat. It is a participant that advises the community with its omens, secures it with its camouflage, leaves it telltale messages in broken twigs and footprints, whispers warnings to it in the wind's voice, nourishes it with the largest of plants and animals, and in its countless functions and counsels is absorbed into the community's nexus of rights and duties. What the ecological ceremonial does, in effect, is socialize the natural world and complete the environment of society with nature. Here, the ceremonial, despite its naively fictive content, speaks more truthfully to the richly articulated interface between society and nature than concepts that deal with the natural world as a matrix, background, or worse, precondition for the social world. Indeed, far from dealing with nature as an it or a thou, to use Martin Buber's terms, the ceremonial validates nature as kin, a blooded, important estate that words like citizen can never attain. Nature is named even before it is defined. It is personified as part of the community before it is raised above it as supernature. To the pygmies of the Ituri forest, it is Ndura, and to the settled Bantu villagers, the same word strictly designates the forest that the pygmies regard as a variable entity in itself, active and formative in all of its functions. Hence, the very notion of nature is always social at this point in human development, in an ontological sense that the protoplasm of humankind retains an abiding community with the protoplasm of nature. To speak in the language of organic societies, the blood that flows between the community and the nature in the process of being kin is circulated by distinct acts of community, ceremonial, dance, dramas, songs, decorations, and symbols. Dancers who imitate animals in their gestures or birds in their calls are engaged in more than mere mimesis. They form a communal and choral unity with nature, a unity that edges into the intimate intercourse of sexuality, birth, and the interchange of blood, by virtue of a community solidarity that such widely bandied terms of stewardship can hardly convey. Organic societies hear a nature and speak for a nature that will be slowly muffled and muted by the civilizations that gain historic ascendancy over them. Until then, nature is no silent word or passive environment lacking meaning beyond the dictates of human manipulation. Hence, social ecology has its origins in humanity's initial awareness of its own sociality, not merely as a cognitive dimension of epistemology, but as an ontological consociation, the natural world. Really beautiful. I can't but not think on a few weeks ago when we spoke about in one of the food forests on the hell loops. There was one in particular that we said that is very prevalent in modernity, which is the oscillation between meaninglessness and nihilism and the void of meaninglessness, and on the other hand, kind of imposed meaning, eternalism, meanings that come from religion, from above, from like a God in the sky, from something out there, a transcendental reality. Why is it? I'm pretty sure that these societies who had and held these ontologies of this kind of level of hearing and seeing and speaking in nature haven't had these problems, haven't had people committing suicide because of nihilism. Because meaning was not something that is in opposition to meaninglessness. Meaning was something to be found in relation with the aliveness of everything. In every relationality, in every contact, in every sound, there is meaning being created, being generated. There is no seeking meaning, and there is also no being oppressed by systems of meaning. There is just meaningness. This is really reminding me this because he's speaking specifically about how, ceremonies were not just these like naive stories of, sacrifices to forces of nature and things like that. They were like they have emerged from the earth itself. Were the very way in which they perceived humans as not just part of society, like not just part of nature, but nature itself.
What you just said about meaning without opposition to meaninglessness is really insightful. I've never thought of it that way. Definitely
I
interesting.
just thought about it right now. Like I was like, oh, that makes so much sense, like
Mm-hmm.
the whole question of what is the meaning only arises from the premise of separation from nature, separation from each other. Otherwise, like if there is no space in between, if there is no fragmentation, what's there to seek, right? Like there is meaningness in the aliveness of everything. It's a relational thing. You are there, you're being taken care of, and you are taken care of. You're part of a circle. And there are ceremonies and dances and stories and tales and sounds and speaking and hearing that is constantly happening, and there is nothing to seek, And so how he also spoke about like, where was it? Yeah. Pre-literate cultures, in fact, often begin with a cosmology consisting of the conclusions that our current bouquet of mystics profess to attain, right? Like, I think a lot of people are realizing right now things that, mystics and mystical traditions have been speaking about, like this notion of direct experience and interconnectedness and a certain sense of oneness to things that kind of cut through both the nihilistic apathy of secular modernity and also through the institutionalized religion and its oppression, because it emphasizes direct experience, a direct mystical experience of a divine, a writing of your own story, right? And he says, like, for them, it was not something to discover through like a psychedelic experience or mystical quests. It was something that was just obvious. There was no opposition to it. It emerged from nature itself.
question is how we refine that, right? How we reconnect with that.
Well, I think, like if we learn anything from these passages is that, when you talk about these like rituals, right? So he said like, yes, there is the kind of the essence of it that a lot of anthropologists and a lot of people in our culture have received from it is like, oh, they had these like beautiful mystical stories of magical thinking, of being able to influence the cycles of nature and so and so and so. But he says, no, there is something a lot deeper than that. These ceremonies were all about, not just the ceremonies, the whole entire array of social codes were all about, they emerged from it's almost hard to comprehend for our own like fragmented minds, but like they emerged from the very relationality with the natural world. And in such, they had a very much an effect on these cycles, right? It's not that they could control the rain literally as much as when these kind of rites of passage and ceremonies and social codes exist, when the cosmologies and ontologies of entanglement with nature exist, we don't get to a point in which we are extracting so much that we get to destroy the environment that we live in and ourselves that we depend on, right? So in that sense, they very much had effects on the cycles of nature, not from above and like trying to control them. Like the idea was never to sing so the rain will come literally because we are above nature and we can control the rain. It was the rain is part of our social structure. The climate, the ecology, the soil, the health of it all, all of it, the sound that come from the leaves, as he says, the leaf that is rattling in the tree was not just a sound that was produced by the wind. It was nature speaking to us. And when you have that kind of cosmology, when you have that such an ontology, you are part of a thriving biosphere that you can depend on, and that depends on you. And in that sense, it's beyond some naive story or magical thinking. It's something very material.
I really like how he describes what you're mentioning as let me see that phrase, the ceremonial validating nature as kin.
Yeah.
I would say overall, these past few passages feel very inspired. I almost feel like Bookchin is really enjoying and writing more poetically even than some of the rest of the book.
Completely. I mean, I haven't read the rest of the book. I've arrived so far until here, but yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. Indeed, far from dealing with nature as an it or a thou, the ceremonial validate nature as kin, blooded, all-important estate that words like citizen can never attain. Nature is named before it is defined. No, sorry. Nature is named before it is deified. I think here he refers to like the deification in the ceremonies, right? Like giving offerings and all that stuff, and eating all these like gods and goddesses and like, deities and figures that correspond with natural forces. Nature is named as kin, as a blooded, all-important estate before it is deified. The deification is a creative, as he says before, a creative social machine, a desiring machine of the social, of the socios that produces these deities in order to come into contact with nature, in order to create and foster that relationality. It's like you would, like if nature is kin, it's like you would, when you were a child, you develop these games with your brothers and sisters or friends, right? You creatively develop these games together in order to what? In order to come into relationship. In a sense, this is the essence of these ceremonies, of these rituals. The creative game of the socios. It's not a deity, the word of God that comes from above or below or before. It's an organically emergent phenomena from the biosphere itself. Will we continue a little bit more? How do you feel like?
Sure. Yep.
You want to read?
Yeah, you got it. I do not mean to deny the old epistemological canon that human beings see nature in social terms, performed by social categories and interests. But this canon requires further articulation and elaboration. The word social should not sweep us into a deluge of intellectual abstractions that ignore the distinctions between one social form and another. It is easy to see that organic society's harmonized view of nature follows directly from the harmonized relations within the early human community. Just as medieval theology structured the Christian heaven on feudal lines, so people of all ages have projected their social structures onto the natural world. To the Algonquians of the North American forest, beavers lived in clans and lodges of their own, wisely cooperating to promote the well-being of the community. Animals also had their magic, their totem ancestors, the elder brother, and were invigorated by the Manitou, whose spirit nourished the entire cosmos. Accordingly, animals had to be conciliated, or else they might refuse to provide humans with skins and meat. The cooperative spirit that formed the basis for the survival of the organic community was an integral part of the outlook of pre-literate people toward nature and the interplay between the natural world and the social. We have yet to find a language that adequately encompasses the quality of this deeply embedded cooperative spirit. Expressions like love of nature or communism, not to speak of the jargon favored by contemporary sociology, are permeated by the problematical relationships of our own society and mentality. Pre-literate humans did not have to love nature. They lived in a kinship relationship with it, a relationship more primary than our use of the term love. They would not distinguish between our aesthetic sense on this score and their own functional approach to the natural world, because natural beauty is there to begin with, in the very cradle of the individual's experience. The poetic language that awakens such admiration among whites who encounter the spokesman for Indian grievances is rarely poetry to the speaker. Rather, it is an unconscious eloquence that reflects the dignity of Indian life. So too with other elements of organic society and its values. Cooperation is too primary to be adequately expressed in the language of Western society. From the outset of life, coercion in dealing with children is so notably rare in most pre-literate communities that Western observers are often astonished by the gentleness with which so-called primitives deal with the most intractable of their young. Yet in pre-literate communities, the parents are not permissive. They simply respect the personality of their children, much as they do that of the adults in their communities. Until age hierarchies begin to emerge, the everyday behavior of parents fosters an almost unbroken continuity in the lives of the young between the years of childhood and adulthood. Farley Mowat, a biologist who lived on the Canadian Barrens among the last remnant band of the Ihalmute Eskimo, noted that if a boy wished to become a hunter, He was not scolded for his presumption or treated with amused condescension. To the contrary, his father seriously fashioned a miniature bow and some arrows that were genuine weapons, not toys. The boy then went out to hunt, encouraged by all the traditional words of good luck that the Ihalmut accorded an experienced adult on his return. On his return, Moat tells us, he is greeted as gravely as if he were his father. The whole camp wishes to hear of his hunt, and he can expect the same ridicule at failure or the same praise if he managed to kill a little bird, which would come upon a full-grown man. So he plays and learns under no shadow of parental disapproval and under no restraint of fear. The Ihalmut are not exceptional. The inherently non-authoritarian relationships Moat encountered between Eskimo children and adults is still quite common in surviving organic societies. It extends not only to ties between children and adults, but also to the prevailing notions of property, exchange, and leadership. Here again, the terminology of Western society fails us. The word property connotes an individual appropriation of goods, a personal claim to tools, land, and other resources. Conceived in this loose sense, property is fairly common in organic societies, even in groups that have a very simple, undeveloped technology. By the same token, cooperative work and the sharing of resources on a scale that could be called communistic is also fairly common. On both the productive side of economic life and the consumptive appropriation of tools, weapons, food, and even clothing may range widely, often idiosyncratically in Western eyes. From the possessive and seemingly individualistic to the most meticulous, often ritualistic, parceling out of a harvest or a hunt among members of a community. But primary to both of these seemingly contrasting relationships is the practice of usufruct, the freedom of individuals in a community to appropriate resources merely by virtue of the fact that they are using them. Such resources belong to the user as long as they are being used. Function, in effect, replaces our hallowed concept of possession, not merely as a loan or even mutual aid, but as an unconscious emphasis on use itself, on need that is free of psychological entanglements with proprietorship, work, and even reciprocity. The Western identification of individuality with ownership and personality with craft, the latter laden with a metaphysics of selfhood as expressed in a crafted object wrested by human powers from an intractable nature, has yet to emerge from the notion of use itself and the guileless enjoyment of needed things. Need, in effect, still orchestrates work to the point where property of any kind, communal or otherwise, has yet to acquire independence from the claims of satisfaction. A collective need subtly orchestrates work, not personal need alone. For the collective claim is implicit in the primacy of usufruct over proprietorship. Hence, even the work performed in one's own dwelling has an underlying collective dimension in the potential availability of its products to the entire community. I had never heard this term usufruct, but this is really interesting.
Yeah, me neither.
I'll keep reading. Communal property, one's property itself, has become a category of consciousness, already marks the first step toward private property. Just as reciprocity, once it too becomes a category of consciousness, marks the first step toward exchange. Proudhon's celebration of mutual aid and contractual federalism, like Marx's celebration of communal property and planned production, marked no appreciable advance over the primal principle of usufruct. Both thinkers were captive to the notion of interest, to the rational satisfaction of egotism. There may have been a period in humanity's early development when interest had not yet emerged to replace complementarity, the disinterested willingness to pool needed things and needed services. There was a time when Gontran the Ponsins, wandering into the most remote reaches of the Arctic, could still encounter the pure, the true Eskimos, the Eskimos who knew not how to lie, and hence to manipulate, to calculate, to project a private interest beyond social need. Here, community attained a completeness so exquisite and artless that needed things and services fit together in a lovely mosaic with a haunting personality of its own. We should not disdain these almost utopian glimpses of humanity's potentialities, with their unsullied qualities for giving and collectivity. Pre-literate peoples that still lack an I with which to replace a we are not, as Levi-Bruhl was to suggest, deficient in individuality as much as they are rich in community. This is a greatness of wealth that can yield a lofty disdain for objects. Footnote. The potlatch ceremonies of the Northwest Coast Indians of America, in fact, no longer clearly reflect the wealth of community that leads to disdain for objects. These disaccumulation ceremonies already fetishize the giving qualities from which they may have been derived, but they remain impressive evidence of more innocent forms of usufruct that lacked all connotations of prestige and social recognition. Cooperation at this point is more than just a cement between members of the group. It is an organic melding of identities that, without losing individual uniqueness, retains and fosters the unity of consociation. Contract, forced into this wholeness, serves merely to subvert it, turning an unthinking sense of responsibility into a calculating nexus of aid and an unconscious sense of collectivity into a preening sense of mutuality. As for reciprocity, so often cited as the highest evocation of collectivity, we shall see that it is more significant in forming alliances between groups than in fostering internal solidarity within them. Usufruct, in short, differs qualitatively from the quid pro quo of reciprocity, exchange, and mutual aid, all of which are trapped within history's demeaning account books with their just ratios and their honest balance sheets. Caught in this limited sphere of calculation, consociation is always tainted by the rationality of arithmetic. The human spirit can never transcend a quantitative world of fair dealings between canny egos whose ideology of interest barely conceals a mean-spirited proclivity for acquisition. To be sure, social forces were to fracture the human collectivity by introducing contractual ties and cultivating the ego's most acquisitive impulses. Insofar as the guileless people of organic societies held to the values of usufruct in an unconscious manner, they remained terribly vulnerable to the lure, often the harsh imposition, of an emergent contractual world. Rarely is history notable for its capacity to select and preserve the most virtuous traits of humanity, but there is still no reason why hope, reinforced by consciousness and redolent with ancestral memories, may not linger within us, an awareness of what humanity has been in the past and what it can become in the future. I think I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, it's a lot. I think it's an interesting elaboration of how even our notions of collaboration, mutual aid, solidarity, all of these kind of things are still emanating from an overall ontology of fragmentation and separation. Like, I think he's doing a pretty good job in like really going beyond the platitudes that these concepts inherit in our culture, in our language, and try to point towards organic societies and how, again, like the past few passages, there he was talking about ceremony, here he's talking about, collaboration and things of that nature. But they all emanate from Earth itself as an obvious relational thing. And then the question always comes like, okay, how do we go towards that? And I'm reminded of something that I heard Deleuze answer to some similar question like that in some interview. I was like, well, if someone knew he would have been doing that instead of talking about it. So we are talking about it, we're trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I really like how this term usufruct, it just moves away from transactional views of the world.
What's your
I think
understanding of
that.
it?
Oh, go ahead.
And what's your understanding of it? I'm curious.
I don't know if I fully have grasped it yet, but maybe I can go back and reread.
Let's read the last. Usufruct, in short, differs qualitatively from the quid pro quo of reciprocity, exchange, and mutual aid. He's even including reciprocity here, which is interesting. I'm always like using reciprocity as like even here in the Discord, usufruct. All of which are trapped within history's demeaning accounts books with their just ratios and their honest balance sheets. Caught in this limited sphere of calculation, consociation is always trained by the rationality of arithmetic. Human spirit can never transcend a quantitative world of fair dealings between canny egos whose ideology of interest barely conceals a mean-spirited proclivity of acquisition. To be sure, social forces were to fracture the human collectivity by introducing contractual ties and cultivating the ego's most acquisitive impulses. Insofar as the guileless people of organic societies held to the values of usufruct in an unconscious manner, they remained terribly vulnerable to the lure, often the harsh imposition, of an emerging contractual world. But there is still no reason why hope, reinforced by consciousness and redolent with ancestral memories, may not linger within us as an awareness of what humanity has been in the past and what it can become in the future. I mean, that's the thing. He's not fully elaborating what usufruct is. It's just contrasting it qualitatively from all the quid pro quo type of reciprocity, exchange, mutual aid, all the just and arithmetic calculations of circulation of resources. And I guess we can.
He
Probably,
does.
yeah.
He does have something a little bit more tangible earlier on, where he's mentioning that it's it's property, but based on the fact that you're simply using it. and just for that amount of time or duration, or so it's not this thing that you literally own, but for that moment you do.
Yeah. It's based on use, not on
Right.
ownership. Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense then. And that also makes sense of the words. Use, usufruct, it's like of use.
I do wonder if he came up with that or if that was already a word.
Well, let's see. Google is a space. Yeah, usufruct. Let's see how it's said. Usufruct. The right to enjoy the use and advantages of another's property short of the destruction or waste of its substance. So it's not, yeah, I mean, I guess here it's still using property of another, but I think he's elaborating something more akin to it's yours to the extent that you are using it and benefiting from it. And then if you, once you are not, it's someone else's. Makes sense how a lot of these organic societies have all kinds of, not all of them, but many had non-monogamous, and even those who were monogamous, seemingly monogamous, had like very different perceptions of very much far away from the ownership sense that we have today in relationality, because a person is not yours. You know, you are enjoying each other, and in the same way, because humans were part of the natural world around, everything was like that. It's not a bad thing to like, oh, we're using each other, because using is not a matter of ownership. Like I'm using usufruct. I'm usufructing this plot of land, you know. Still, in many places, like here, for example, in Chiapas, all of the Ejido territories, which are designated to indigenous people, they are very different. It depends on the municipalities, and it's like a pretty complex kind of system. But in almost all of the these communities, you don't really own the land that you are on. Like, there are people who own some land, so this is why I'm saying it's complex. It's not like a black and white thing. And of course, modernity and capitalism has infiltrated everything right now in our world. But for example, you can go to become part of these communities, ask for a piece of land, have like a piece of like a little lot that dedicated to you, and you can build a house there. But if you're going away for months or years, someone else will go and live there, right? Like, it's not yours. You can't get like a deed, like you can get with other privately owned land around the country. And so I think it's something like that, you know, like you, but maybe more elaborate, not just about land, but about everything, you know.
It really goes against everything that we currently do in you know, modern Western culture. And you really would have to. I was about to say give up, but it's not really giving up anything. It's just it already exists. It's already there, and
Yeah.
you can use it if you need it. But you know, like I'm sitting in my house right now. In this scenario, someone that needs a house can come and live there for a period of time, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would go farther. Like there would no, there have, there would not be a person that is homeless to begin with.
Right, right.
There's enough land, right? Like, so we get to this like, but yeah, generally, if you would now, you know, go for a few years or decide to move to a different place, a different community, a different tribe, you know, whatever, and yeah, someone could come in and live. It's not your thing. But at the same time, like, there are a lot of things that we think of in terms of ownership. There are also a lot of things that we are already applying all of these things. And I think, you know, think about libraries. Think about people who practice all kinds of, you know, relationship anarchy and polyamory, you know, kind of, you know, intentionally deconstructing ownership. Not that that's the only way, you can still be monogamous or whatever, but the idea is to intentionally see where the ownership parts shows up and deconstruct that script. And there are many other things, like people share gardens. There are, like, even I saw in Berlin, in Germany, like there are these places, like kind of city gardens all around Berlin that you can kind of use for a while. There is like a limited amount of time you're using it, you're enjoying it. There is like a tiny little garden that you can cultivate, and there is a little shed. But then at some point, someone else would come and use it. So there are a lot of ways in which we are already open, or, as he said, have that ancestral memory in us, because it didn't go anywhere, right? Like, we are made out of all of these societies. These societies didn't completely disappear. Their ontologies and logics and cosmologies exist in us. And so, yes, it is on the obvious level kind of far-fetched for most of us, and immediately. But then when you start thinking about it more and more, you're like, it's not that far-fetched to reimagine ownership, to reconstruct that notion in our day-to-day life, right? Like, there are very many ways that it's already happening.
Love those examples you gave, and it makes me think, what are ways we can take those currently existing versions of this and widen them and open them up so that it spreads into other areas.
Yeah. Well, maybe we keep this question open and end the reading here, and allow these questions to percolate and permeate, and see what ideas we can come up with.
Absolutely.